Welcome, everyone. We'll give folks one more minute before we get started. Great seeing you all. Feel free to put your name and where you're joining us from, and maybe what you do in the world, whatever you'd like to put in there, and introduce yourself as folks come on in. We'll get started in just a few, in a minute for sure. I don't want to go too long.
Have a little lunch snack here.
Well, let's start. Welcome, everyone. Vernon Wall here, he, him pronouns, Director of Business Development with Leadership. So excited that you're here joining us. I'm joined, my great colleague, Abby's here. I'm going to have her introduce herself so you'll know her.
Sorry, I was just sending a quick message to someone in the chat. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm Abby Prince. I'm the Director of Program Quality and Management at Leadership. I'm here in Central Illinois, where it is a scorcher today. We're in the hundreds and it does not feel good outside, friends. So this is the coolest part of my day, is joining you all to chat with John.
Ooh, 100 degrees, that's not cute. That's not cute at all.
It's not.
Well, we're so happy that you're here. I'd like to, first of all, begin by, I don't think, well, anyone who's maybe from another planet has not been in a virtual space, but we do want to let you know that the way we've used Zoom during our virtual conversations is really to, number one, we really would love for you to post your comments and questions in the area. And we've found that our chats have been a little bit more robust than most Zoom experiences that I've been on. People are talking to each other, asking questions, not only to our facilitator, but also to each other, and sort of supporting them as we do this great work. We will do some polls, and they will pop up on the screen, and you can respond. Also, too, we'll have a good number of people here. We're already up to 60. And I'm thinking we're going to continue to add folks in. So we probably won't be able to have folks unmute to ask questions, but Abby and I will be monitoring the chat. If there's something that you'd like to ask any of us, we'll definitely make sure that that happens. So just wanted to let you know that. The other thing we always do at the beginning of our presentations is a land acknowledgement. And I always begin by saying that for us, a land acknowledgement is not something that should be a checkbox. A land acknowledgement is embracing really three things. One, Native and Indigenous people who settle the land in which we inhabit and continue to thrive and grow and learn in those communities. And for me, I'm from Washington, D.C., the ancestral homelands of many Native and Indigenous tribes, but primarily the Piscataway and the Anacostic. And so really for us, it's about that. Number two, it's about us thinking about our own ancestry and how we are standing on the shoulders of people who came before us. And that allows us to connect with Native Indigenous folks in ways that we may not think. And the third is, how can we continue to decolonize our work? What is it like to be about equity? And so when you see a land acknowledgement, I'd want you to make sure that you pause for a moment for those three things and think about the Native and Indigenous communities where you are currently living. Thank you so much. For those of you who do not know us, Leadership is a not-for-profit, that our vision is a just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. And our mission is to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. later on, I'll be sharing some of our programmatic initiatives that we have that we'd love for you to engage us in. But do want to let you know that this all began, these conversations began during the time when we were all quarantined. And we at Leadership, to be honest, we were, a little worried about what was going to happen when we could not be on your campuses. And so we said, well, we want to make sure that we continue conversations at the very, very least. And so we decided to offer these free conversations, and we found them to be very, enlightening and more empowering, and really giving people sort of some rejuvenation during these times. So we're excited to have you with us. There's so many definitions of leadership out there. Just want to share with you that Leadership believes that leadership involves living in a state of possibility, making a commitment to a vision, developing relationships to move that vision into action, and sustaining a high level of integrity. Effective leadership takes place in the context of a community and results in a more equitable society. And so that's the way we frame our programs when we develop them and when we share them both virtually and in person. Now, the reason why you're here is not me. It is one of my very good friends and colleagues, and what I would say, and he will get embarrassed, but one of the most thoughtful scholars we have in leadership education out there. And one of the things that I shared with John before you all came on is, I do believe that what typically happens is we have folks that are either focused on theories and theoretical sort of theoretical pedagogy in order for us to be successful, which is great. And we have some people who really focus on narratives and making sure that we, tell stories and, have personal experiences. But John is one of the few scholars out there that combines both. He allows for us to feel theories and to experience them rather than just be able to say, well, John Dugan wrote about this. Oh, that's cute. But what does it mean? What does it look like? And so, John, welcome. Thank you. Say hey to the peoples.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you. And yes, I'm like smiling in embarrassment, but yes, thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm just excited. I just want to make sure we just keep going, because I want to make sure that John has as much time as possible in order to really talk about, this piece around toward identity responsiveness. What does that look like? And, especially in terms of justice-based leadership development. So let's start off with some polls. So get ready, and let's see how Vernon is with poll number one. Of course, nope, that's not the right one. Thank God I looked. Ooh. Okay, here's the first one. How many people have direct responsibility for youth leadership development as part of your position? Coming in. Looks like we're about up to 50% of you all are in there. All right. I think we've got everybody in there. Yep, cool. Here's the results. So 45% primary, secondary, 30%. Not part of my responsibility, 24%. John, any reactions to that?
Yeah, well, that 75% tells us that in some way, shape, or form, folks in this space are having oversight, direct responsibility, some connection to the leadership development work. And for the 24% who are not, I'm curious about how much of that, and please share in the chat, is an interest that brings you into leadership, or you see yourself as involved in leadership, but not as the responsibility of your job. I feel like for many of us, it doesn't fall within our purview, but it is still something we do directly because of how we think about youth development, human capacity building in general. So interested to hear about the 24%, what moves you?
Great. All right. Let's go to one more poll. And now my computer decides it doesn't want to work. So 1 second. There we go. To what degree does equity play a role in your leadership program design?
And what I would say here is, for those of you who said, I don't have any oversight of leadership, think about where you are engaging with leadership development. To what role then in your context does equity show up?
All right, we've got a good number of folks, a few more in there. They're coming in a nice clip. We're almost done. A few more folks get in there. All right, here we go.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
I mean, my immediate reaction is, if we looked at these data back in, say, 2005, so this distribution would look quite different. And Julie Owen, I know, is on the call and has tracked some of this through her own research, but the degree to which an organization actually embeds leadership as more than a diversity day or one element of content versus systematically through the work has increased pretty substantially over time, which is a testament, I think, to both how we're pushing the field, but also an indicator that we have a lot more room to go. But I can't imagine that even perhaps 5 years ago, we would have had 41% of folks routinely designing and conducting equity audits around the content of leadership development. So this, to me, is a source of both hope and motivation for us to continue this work and this pathway of collectively looking at how do we integrate equity into this work with leadership development. I wonder if we could go one step further. So we've sort of mapped the territory of what role does leadership play in your lives. We've spent some time now identifying what role does equity play and how you integrate and show up in terms of leadership. Let's switch to a chatterfall, and shout out to Kristen Salente-Skandal, who has introduced me to this teaching technique, and ask everyone to type a response to a question that you see on screen. So if you're engaging with equity in your leadership development programs, what is the most compelling issue you face with regard to that integration of equity into your program design? I'm going to ask you to type your response in the chat, but hold on hitting submit. What we're going to do is aggregate everyone's responses and let them flow. I'm then going to ask you to backtrack, and collectively we're going to look at patterns you see and how this may look in terms of unique differences and commonalities. So just take 30 seconds to think of a response to this to type into the chat, and I'll give you an indicator when to hit send. We'd put on the Jeopardy music now if we had it queued up and ready to go.
If we would have given Abby a heads up, she would have been ready for that, because she's
right.
Mm-hmm.
The choice is elevator music that causes lunchtime post drowsiness, or the Jeopardy music, which for me is anxiety inducing, but will not put me to sleep. All right, we're going to count down from 3, and I'm going to ask everyone to click send. 3, 2, 1, and we should start seeing these. And if you scroll all the way back up to the top, let's take a moment, and I'm going to ask you to first look for commonalities and then look for differences to see if there's any pattern recognition around responses. And we'll take a minute to then pull that information forward. So I'm seeing folks wrestling with what are the nuances of identity and positionality and leadership. Leslie, and that is such a difficult piece when you're both attempting to look at what's the developmental trajectory and how do you actually acknowledge that sometimes where people are is where they need to be. And our job is not to pull or push, but to prime and set an environmental context for learning. So how do you do that in the context of all of the positionality that comes with it? Great question. Different definitions, Avani, we'll cover a little bit of that today to see if we can coalesce around some common themes there. Different levels. So how do we position folks? I always think of one of the core tenets of student development theory around +1 staging and how that looks when you actually comprise the small groups we're in? And are young people ready based on their development to actually have the conversation they need, or the conversation that's happening perhaps is not situated in a way that's supportive for a positive outcome? It's new, absolutely. The degree to which this is being integrated and how is changing based on political concerns. I can tell you as a nonprofit leader, the concern around critical race theory is one that, as somebody who's published on that extensively, I get very frustrated with, but I have to navigate. If we're trying to keep the money coming in to support youth and programs most distant from opportunity, how do we reach people who that term is a threat without acquiescing or giving away the core tenets of what we believe? So that pushback, that hesitation, I see that repeatedly through here. And I think that's a really strong reality for a whole lot of folks. Empathy and understanding, Matt, thank you for that, around the perspectives of others. I am constantly reminded that when we talk about equity, we're dealing also with the neuroscience of brain-based thinking and how our physiological response, it's not just an emotional response, but our physiological response often shapes how we show up or don't show up in sessions. Anyone seen other themes they would pull out into the conversation from this chatterfall?
John, I was thinking a little about, as you mentioned, critical race theory, the sort of the resistance around the language. First of all, people typically who are resisting don't really know what critical race theory is. So I just go, okay, whatever. And what I always tell people all the time is, you can do, I never even use the term critical race theory when I'm doing my presentations. I would never do that, but I will infuse the concepts and the theoretical background into my stories. And so we can do the work and be about the work of anti-racism, critical race theory, whatever we want to do. And we don't need to mention it, and it's fine. I'm really concerned that there's this resistance from us around. I think it goes back to nobody's integrating it into what we do. They just want to make sure that they say the words. And I'm thinking, no, we integrate the concepts into how we do things.
Well, this is a pinch moment for us, Vernon, I would argue in some ways, because it's bi-directional. So we also have to handle a defensive posturing around now, not just critical race theory, but also any type of diversity integration, any type of representation that perhaps poses a threat. So we spend energy and time defending that. And at the same time, how attached are we to language and pedagogy that can operate in the background? And are we fighting developmental struggles that we're not going to win, as opposed to just reinvesting in the energy of the work? I think of folks like Grace Lee Boggs from the civil rights movement, who so constantly thought about smart activism and the way in which we need to understand our audience. You go all the way back to Alinsky and his sort of tenets of community organizing, that humor, that how we actually use accomplices and allies, the ways in which we actually think strategically about which battles to fight and when, become part of the repertoire. And I wonder if at some level, many of us got comfortable with what was not overt resistance to the integration of equity into leadership, and miscued that as a readiness to actually change systems and structures. And in fact, it was placating in some ways. And what we were doing maybe did not push the envelope in ways that perhaps were as threatening as to where we're at today.
Well, and what I would say, John, is I believe too, that in our privileged identities, we are more, it's more evident about pushing back to the resistance. It's almost as though there's this energy around, I've got to prove myself as an accomplice or an ally, so I'm going to be the one to be very vocal and loud about this resistance. Whereas those of us in our minoritized identities, this is our life every day. So right. We just kind of say we've got to navigate it in a very, as you shared, very simply, around, active. How can we be more, engaging in our activism? So absolutely.
Well, this is perhaps a nice segue into some of the content we wanted to cover. And I think what this Chatterfall begins to tease out is that each of you are looking at this from very different angles, from thinking about the individual human and how do you develop empathy and how do we integrate this into our programs, to the program level where it's really about how do you pull people who are not engaged in? Are we getting the usual suspects and polishing diamonds versus actually creating differences in mindset and competence? And then what does it mean at the systems level if all of this is meant to actually disrupt and change? And what does it look like to treat perhaps all three of us at once? And if you all would let me, I'd like to back up one step and just share a little bit from my journey over the last 5 years. One of the most exciting things for me was when you all were popping in, it's like, Jen, oh my goodness, there's my cluster facilitator partner from leadership from years ago, Leslie and Denny. I mean, it's only a little bit embarrassing when you have this constellation of people in a room who have so shaped my thinking. So I want to start by acknowledging that anything I share is really only a function of the energy and knowledge and wisdom that's been poured into me from leadership, from you, Vernon, from just about, I would say, most people on this call. And so I'm but sort of like an amplifier here, but the knowledge and wisdom in this room is key. The second thing is, this is a homecoming of sorts because I've been in the nonprofit sector now myself for the past 5 years. And what most folks don't know about my story is I came in very shortly after the organizational structure shifted, and I was handed a portfolio of programs designed to serve those most distant from opportunity, largely youth and families from the lowest quartile of the socioeconomic ladder, mostly youth of color, who are struggling with intersectional complexities to how they navigate the world and the systems they're a part of. Our leadership approach was wholly inadequate to actually meet the audience needs. So we started thinking about, are we ticking the boxes of diversity, but not actually engaging in the full range of equity along a continuum that actually changes the narrative and story? And so when we looked at the program, there were parts that were very strong in certain portfolios and others that really needed quite a bit of overhaul. What stood out to me the most was the importance of doing this with an in-community. So part of the conversation I'd love for us to have today is really about what does it look like to change our paradigm writ large so that we are not the arbiters of what our content, our outcomes look like, but it is surfaced through students, through community, through the folks that we're working with. Many of us will be familiar with the language of cultural relevancy and sensitivity. If any of you know Vernon's work, you probably saw what I did with the title. One of Vernon's and his colleagues' earlier works around queer issues really started with beyond tolerance towards acceptance and this notion of what is the floor and what is the ceiling in this work? And how does that shift over time? So I can think back to my own undergraduate experience, and diversity was the floor. And so compositional diversity and trying to get to that was the base minimum. There wasn't a belief that there was relevancy or a need for even perhaps sensitivity, or that was percolating, but it was really about, can you get a diverse array or mosaic of people in a room? And we all know, thanks to Gloria Ladson-Billings' beautiful writing, that when we open that front door to compositional diversity, oftentimes our institutions, our programs leave the back door wide open, meaning we bring someone in, the house isn't staged for them, it's not designed for them, and then they walk directly out the back door. And the way that plays out in the work that we do at the grassroots community level is a cost-benefit analysis. So what happens when our approach is simply the floor of cultural relevancy and sensitivity? If we fail there, then those most distant from opportunity are expending very scarce resources, time that they're not earning wages, time that they're not supporting family, on interventions that do not make a material difference in their lives. So it's not just that they didn't get something out of the program. The folks we're working with expend something to be there in the first place. So if we can extend cultural relevancy beyond just an assumption of what is it that the pedagogy does to an understanding of what is the ecosystem in which people come to us, it actually changes the meaning. Gloria Ladson-Billings set the table for us around cultural relevancy. How does our curriculum reflect students' backgrounds, intersecting identities, political nature of who they are and how they show up in spaces? This would apply to everything from standardized tests to questions. How do they actually shape and be relevant to the knowledge of a young person and their lived experiences? Part of what then is coupled and built off of that is we can be culturally relevant, but that does not mean that folks who have to then implement have the actual cultural sensitivity to meet and rise to those standards. And so then we end up with programs that may have a degree of relevancy, but it's all lost in the delivery. So cultural relevancy always has to be systematically coupled with cultural sensitivity. So the awareness, the appreciation, the ability to deliver by those of us who are in positions of authority or power, those of us who are facilitating, those who we train as facilitators, all have that same body of knowledge to draw from. One of the things that I often share here is, what does it mean and look like functionally for us? So this could be this is the point where I say, oh my goodness, please don't leave. I'm going to say something that I think is probably heretical, but stay with me. The example I'll use here is Gallup Strengths. So Gallup Strengths has supported and given many people many insights into who they are. It disrupts imposter syndrome. How people use it often is folks seeing for the first time in themselves something that is beneficial, something that they can latch on to into their own leadership development. But when you actually look at the structure of how the strengths inventory is created, it is not designed for cultural relevancy, nor are there systematic checks in place so that the delivery of it is coupled with cultural sensitivity. I want to share the story of Isaac. So Isaac appears in a lot of my writing. He is what I would say probably one of the most talented students I worked with in my years as a faculty member. Isaac, everyone wanted to hire. Every internship, apprenticeship, they're like, give us Isaac. But Isaac's dream was to actually go back to California. He's a first generation queer student of color from an undocumented family. So his goal was come to Chicago, get this degree, go back and have an impact in my career and home. Isaac interviews for a job in student affairs with leadership development, goes through 3 interviews. We love our processes that are like 18 days long and 16 hurdles and a 5K in the middle of it just to make sure people have stamina. He does all of that. And then he ends up at one of our professional associations final meeting, gets walked out, and the hiring agent says, Isaac, we are so thrilled. It just feels like a fit. We're going to invite you to campus. We're not bringing any other folks to campus. This is just a final vetting. We'll let you know tomorrow about when the campus interview will be. Cut to the next day, and Isaac receives an email he forwards me that uninvites for the campus interview and says, I'm so sorry. As you were exiting, we asked you if you had taken strengths. And Isaac said, yes. I think I took it as an RA, I'm not quite sure. And the hiring agent asked what the talent streams were. He names them and says, I think my top is activator. That team was attempting to diversify based on strengths. And so the hiring agent in the email said, I'm so sorry, but we have all activators on our team. And so that means we're not going to be able to continue you in this search. They went on to hire a white person for their entirely white team, and to frame that this approach was used to diversify their team, and a queer man of color who is first generation college student, high profile, highly talented, was actually cut from a process based on a strengths typing. Now, what most people don't know is that if you actually go back into the actual measurement tool, 70% of those scales don't meet the standard criteria for reliability and validity. And when used with communities of color, that drops down to about a 70% error rate. So the very scale on which he was measured as an activator is not actually a scale that can be used with students of color. And yet we continue to use it, despite 70% error in the return, without thinking about how the lack of relevancy of that tool with populations other than white folk then shapes people's experiences in very real and material ways, like not securing a job, by being eliminated by giving someone a perfectly logical explanation to explain away the introduction of actual racial diversity within a team. So I think we sometimes step away and say, we're all at the floor, but we have to actually look and uncover, where is that cultural relevancy in our work? Where is the sensitivity? And just so we're not indicting others and we're indicting ourselves, as we looked at our programs at Aspen, one of the first programs that I inherited, driven in community, meant to be uplifted by community, was flying in moderators from all over the country who had no contextual knowledge of the lived experience in Helena, West Helena, Arkansas, St. Louis, Miami, all of the places we were operating. We had inadvertently brought in experts who lacked the cultural relevancy and the sensitivity to actually design a program for the populations we were working with. And so we had to actually stop, pull back, and ask that question of, what would it look like to do this better? If we go to the next slide and we think about, if that's the floor, what are the walls? So I grew up doing labor for the Chicago Labor Union and a construction family. And so I always think of building. So if the foundation is set, then we can talk about all of the framing of the house. This is a movement away from a base level of cultural sensitivity to actually culturally sustaining work. I'd encourage you all to look at the work of Paris and Alim, who have really done a beautiful job of naming this. And one piece or caveat I want to say here is they also acknowledge that the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and the American Psychological Association is still needed. And so when we offer critique here, it's from a place of praise, acknowledgement of the step forwards that Gloria made, and the recognition that it's a both and. Cultural sustaining work moves us into a place of acknowledging all of the political dynamics that play out based on one person's identity in multiple systems. It values cultural dexterity, the ability to code switch, the ability to speak to and interact across difference in a wide range of ways. It's about asset, not deficit. It's about calling for schooling to be a site of sustaining rather than eradicating cultural ways of community. So again, I'll look at ourselves and hold the mirror up to Aspen. We went into communities and said, we have the solution for you, as opposed to going into communities to say, what are the most compelling problems? What are the ways that you can identify to solve these problems? How can we be accomplices in this? And what are the ways in which we can transfer at your direction, the human, the financial, the social capital necessary to actually disrupt this? It's acknowledging Yoso's work about community cultural wealth, that what appears as deficit is often asset, and that we have to remove the blinders of our own whiteness, our own gender dominance, our own ability dominance, so that we can actually see the shared reality of how this affects not just minoritized communities, but also communities who are in a position of power. And that's the shift from culturally sustaining to identity responsiveness, to look at any system and acknowledge that what we're creating by default needs to be responsive to intersecting identities. It has to be engaging at a level that understands that this is of benefit to everyone. Cultural relevancy almost intuitively cues to us, our job is to make this relevant to the other, with the positionality of male identifying, socioeconomically privileged, heterosexual folks as the frame of reference that's normative. So folks that are a lot like me. So how do we then shift that and say, it's not about designing for communities of color, for women. It's about thinking about what's a totality of the design. And what happens when we invite folks from those identities into the design process, so that from the jump, we are identity responsive, as opposed to trying to retrofit programs, structures, interventions into a model of cultural sensitivity. This is incredibly hard work. I think about the work that some of my colleagues at Aspen are doing right now, actually building networks of moderators and at the ground level in community, thinking about how we deploy resources, and our work with leadership development, inviting parents and family in as a core dimension of the program, acknowledging the labor that our students do outside of higher education and community organizations through activism. all of that becomes part of an identity responsive curricula. Let's go one step further.
Oh, John, if I could just interject real quick. I'm just seeing so many comments in the chat around like, oh, you've changed the way I think about this and you've shed this light on this, and some resources being shared there. I see Adrienne has shared a resource from Nick and Laura, just in talking more about Strengths Quest, more resources there available for folks to, Julie sharing some resources here to your book, John. So some more helpful information there as well being shared in the chat. Great conversations happening there.
Well, and I love this because, and Abby, thank you so much for pointing that out, but thank you for putting these in, because these are resources for me as well. We're all on a collective journey here. And I think where my hope comes from is what was beyond tolerance as an 18-year-old trying to come into my own identity is further along than beyond acceptance. And we can do this collectively together if we begin to think about what is this next step in this continuum of justice.
Yeah, John, too, I was thinking too, as you're talking, I always talk about making sure that as I look around the room and I see students in the room, we have to first help them unpack their identities, their privileged and marginalized identities, and then say, now let's connect the dots. You need to be seen in this experience. So yes, I could be identified as Christian, white, cisgender male from the Upper East Side of New York City, and I need to be able to see myself in this work rather than outwardly focused, because that's what we always do. We're still stuck in the 1990s. It's like, we've got this identity group that is marginalized. They're just like us. Treat them better. That's very privileged group centered. It's like, no. It's like, I've got to be able to see myself in your program with all of my identities.
Yep. I'll share, Vernon, one of the most powerful conversations I had was pre-pandemic in the Delta. If folks are not familiar with the Mississippi Delta, it is one of the most talent-rich areas I have ever been to. Now, folks in the South would consider what we consider, if you're from the North, the Deep South, they would consider the Delta the Deep South. It has been an area of historical divestment for decades and decades and decades and decades, but that hasn't undermined the richness of talent. It's the resourcing and structure and systems. And we were sitting on the floor. If some of you know Dr. Rob Kelly, he had come in and spoken via Zoom to the students. A group was entirely Black, African-American. Afterwards, one of our students, as we were processing the conversation, said, "This is so powerful, but at the end of the day, what is the point of me engaging in leadership? Because I know I can do it. I believe in it. But it is so scary for my parents, not because they don't believe I can, but there is true and real risk for me to engage in this, coupled with their own labor and struggles where they could not surmount systems. And so they don't want me to have the same realization that some of this won't change in my lifetime." Mm-hmm. And so is there a point in engaging if we have to acknowledge that the likelihood of change is not going to happen, and it's this scary for our parents? And so a cultural sensitivity response would be to acknowledge, to validate. An identity responsive approach would look entirely different, of how do we actually alter that reality? And what the young people then began to open up is, we need our family in these spaces to see that things are changing. We need them to see leaders who look like them represented in the program, so they know they can trust that they are going to safeguard what is high risk engagement. So for these young folks, they planned the first Black Lives Matter marches that ever occurred in Helena, West Helena in Arkansas. The fallout for them and their family was that in a rural region with only about 2 gas stations and 3 little convenient marts, they could no longer go into most of those gas stations and grocery stores because they were ostracized. So I think we forget that there's real damage. And I think that is a place where our privileged identities begin to show up and then frame even the smallest elements of our program. Again, an identity responsive approach would acknowledge, what is the socioeconomic risk for someone even engaging in this work? What are they having to give up so that if our programs don't make a material difference, they haven't just lost out on an experience that could have been beneficial. They now don't have childcare for their children. They have given something up in this process. If we go to the next slide, I think there's a way to sort of begin to pull all of this together. And this is by no means anything I'm sharing today like truth with a capital T. This is exploration of how we're beginning to think of it in the units that I work with. I'm beginning to write about it, and how I hope that as a community we can begin to talk through. So our culturally responsive teachings interact and are built on that root of culturally relevancy. So if it's not relevant, you can't really be responsive. You can be sensitive, but if it's not relevant, does it really matter? And so all of the roots of this are coming from a recognition that marginalized communities, minoritized communities disproportionately know the solutions to their problems, if we can actually provide them with the resources to deliver against that. Serve as allies and advocates and accomplices in the work, and not position ourselves as the arbiters, as the scholars, as the people who are driving it. And that's a different way to show up. I also think we can look at this along a continuum, because it's important to paint a picture of growth, but also a picture of where we want to head. So on a continuum, if we go to the next slide, you'll see sort of a range of equity approaches in design that go from negligent, and I'd argue that the program I inherited, one of them was likely negligent in how it approached it, harm was being done, to programs that have benign neglect or a willful blindness to the needs. So the very minimum actions are taken, or there's an acceptance. One of the acceptances that I know I've spoke with many of you about is who attends our most sort of hallmark leadership development programs on campus, whether that's a peer program, a student organization. And when we see a lack of representational diversity, compositional diversity, the original floor, we don't intervene. That would be willful blindness. When we know that something was designed not by and for and with, but on top of, and we choose not to step back, that would be benign neglect. And it's complicated. And I think if we don't talk about the places where we are negligent or experiencing benign neglect, it gets hard to get out of it. I'm going to give you an example of this. In the Rush to Salvage program, and I'm going to talk about this one program in particular at Aspen, we had a choice. So the program wasn't working, but it was funded externally. So are we going to fix it in a way that the funders will still adopt it? And so in a capitalistic system, the choices we're making aren't free flowing. They're a function of where does the financial resource come from? If we go this route and we push against and toward, if we push against negligence and towards identity responsiveness, who will come along with us and who will not be part of that process? And our funders are often across the ideological spectrum. So I have funders who would argue that Black Lives Matter prior to George Floyd was a destructive force. We should not be engaging with that, who now have come along with us, but we had to carry them to some extent to that place of where they're now, I think, at the borders of relevance and sensitivity. We could have cut them and said, great, we'll find funding elsewhere. That put the community at risk. So rather than making those decisions ourselves, what we did is we sat with community and said, here's the choices that are before us. Do we want to pivot and redesign this program in a way that's truly sustaining to these ecosystems? Or do we want to pull back and have relevance and sensitivity and bring the funders along? And as is often the case, the community pointed out a third path that we did not identify ourselves, which is there a way to actually leverage the Aspen Institute for revenue generation? So we cannot be beholden to external funders, but we have our own source of income to come and move in different ways. And the answer was, of course, duh. But from our privileged identities, sitting at the Aspen Institute, sitting where we're sitting, we just did not even think about that. And I'm laughing because I think I saw Ali Shipma at some point on here, and Ali and I went through a whole research process where we were talking with colleagues about how they do this work. And I have this very vivid memory of Art Johnston, who's a leader here in the city of Chicago, saying something I did not understand over the course of many interviews with Ali. I now think I have a better understanding. He said, we cannot adopt in our work for equity a high school civics lens of what it means to create change. And our high school civics lens is good people will do the right things under the right conditions for the right reasons. All you have to do is look at government and what's happening today to know that is simply not true. It completely removes from this continuum power and the reality of how power flows through every one of these decisions. For those who are coming from a privileged identity, how do we get them off loss, grief, ego, and actually reposition those not as solutions and solution making and action on behalf of, but openness and empathy and perspective taking in a way that sees this as their issue. So as a white man, this is my issue just as much as it is an issue of the communities I work with, for example, in the Mississippi Delta. I may not be from there, but that is my issue as well. And that changes the way we do this work. But that high school civics example always landed with me because all of the noise Art would talk about is really about not realizing what at the end of the day is going to move the needle. And in the Delta, the community knew it's not dumping funders who we need. It's about bringing some of them along, setting very clear boundaries with others, and then generating a third path, to use the language of Desmond Tutu, that we had not even thought of or conceived of because it wasn't an ecosystem that was ours. And so all of these speak to one another, and probably, I shouldn't have put them in a straight line. They probably should be in some type of circle because we cycle through this at different points. There are clearly programs that Kristen Skendel and I are working on right now that have degrees of benign neglect, and we're trying to solve for that. And so it's constantly a work of all of these in connection with one another. Let's go to a last slide. I'm curious if you are being honest and thoughtful about a hallmark program that you work with. Now, this could be a piece of scholarship you're working on. It could be a program, an intervention, a strategy. Think about that hallmark program. And we're going to put a poll up. I'm going to ask you to think about, if you were to realistically assess, where are you in a place of that, where's that program in a place of cultural negligence, benign neglect, relevancy and sensitivity, sustaining, or identity responsiveness? I'm going to ask everyone to respond to this so we can get a sense of even our own degree of ability to acknowledge all of this. So you should see the poll that has come up now.
Coming in, got a few more. Give people a little bit more time. I have a feeling, John, folks are going, well, could I check more than one?
Right. And this is hard because part of what we're saying is there's always going to be work to be done, but how does it shift the conversation when we're actually able to say, look, we're not where we want to be, and we're shoring up the floor across the board, and then we'll get into issues beyond relevancy. And that could be okay, but we have to first acknowledge that. Notice we very rarely talk about an equity continuum that acknowledges negligence and willful blindness or neglect. We have to start having that conversation to position and name where harm might be being done versus where we truly are centering community.
Awesome. Here are some of the results here.
And this is not surprising, right? So most of us who would come to a conversation like the one we're having today are not going to be in a place of negligence. We may have programs we inherited, that we designed, that we know are not necessarily negligent, but we haven't done as much as we could. So a little bit more around that benign neglect, willful blindness, and a whole lot of us are still operating in relevancy and sensitivity. To what extent, and let's use the chat for this, is this a surprise for you that many of us are still in a model of bolstering relevancy and sensitivity to equity in our work?
Well, John, and as folks are typing in, I'm thinking about the cultural benign neglect piece. And I know that when I was on the campus and advised sort of the pinnacle student organization that everyone really looked to be the pinnacle student organization on campus. They coordinated an event, a week-long event, and everybody wanted to be a part of, well, I shouldn't say that. People knew that it was the pinnacle leadership event, and everyone that was in it were white Greek students. And I was asked to advise it. And I remember my tact, or I knew I wanted the group the organization to look different. But what I was doing was going to individual people and saying, you need to apply. You need to apply. You can be a part of this, rather than looking at how did this become this type of organization, and how do I start from the inside and go out rather than going outside in. And I it's always like you think about how could I have been more successful if I would have thought about exactly what you're talking about in terms of moving toward cultural sustainability, rather than this piece around, well, we're going to find at least one to put in here. And it wasn't just students of color, it was like Greek students. I mean, it was just like non-Greek students. And so you got me thinking about ways in which we can shift that narrative around. Once again, the problem is the minoritized folks not applying or not being involved, but they're looking at it saying, there's no place for me. I mean, the system is set up. Why would I want to be a part of that? So, yeah.
Well, and I think that's a great example, Vernon. I also think of examples of where Jamila, I think that your comment in the chat is spot on. The range of energy towards moving a program to identity responsiveness is tough, because you land in into a place of sensitivity and relevancy, often because there's either resistance or we're asked with our programs to serve everyone. And our programs are based on models and data and concepts that are often not grounded in the input of everyone. And so when we design these programs, even with our best of intentions, they're predicated on assumptions, particularly of whiteness, of how people congregate, how systems change. And there's a strategy part of this that has to play out in the background. And many people don't have the power authoritatively within our organizations to make that change. At Aspen, my strategy was look over there, to steal a line from one of my favorite drag queens from RuPaul's Drag Race. Jada Essence Hall is always like, look over there. And it's for like her comedy thing. Whenever, she's about to screw up or something's happening, it's distraction. Well, sometimes as a political tool, distraction can actually be a really healthy and productive vehicle, because it gives you the time to actually build and then release the result, not the process. And the result for some folks is what actually leads to change. One of my good mentors always said, you have to understand what moves the needle in your organization. And she very smartly walked through and said, when you were at UNLV, what moved the needle? Data. If I gave them an ounce of data, they were like, done, no questions asked. Here's $60,000 for programming. At University of Maryland, it was relationships. What does it mean to be a good campus citizen? And if someone perceived you as a good campus citizen, that relational glue led to trust in ways that when things are provocative, folks often felt, well, we trust John, or we trust Denny, or Julie. So let's move into this. I could show up with a ton of data, but if the trust wasn't there, forget it, it wasn't happening. And at Loyola, it was all about mission. So if I could tie something to mission, and I could make the people who were in a power structure feel like it advanced their goals, it would work. I had often very naively operated from sort of a cultural relevancy standpoint and thought good people will do good things for the right reasons. And even diversification in ways that allowed a narrative at the institutional level were not sufficient because of the threat of what that meant for the power people would have after the fact and what it would open up. So the strategy from all of that learning at Aspen was, look over there, we're going to triage this, and we will let you know when we come to a place where we think we're ready for a sound assessment. And then people came in and said, whoa, what is going on? You're not using this Aspen canon that is beautiful and rich, but also needs to have better representation, better relevancy. So we were actually moved into sustaining by saying, let's actually source other types of content. And by saying, look over there, it gave us the space to do that. We shifted from saying we have to have these moderators fly in who are experts and who will tell you and your community where the deficits are and what to work on, to building that from the ground up within community and just simply strategically naming it facilitating instead of naming it moderating. And that definitional change strategically caused people to look the other way until we had results. And the one last thing, because all of us, I think, are hungry for ways to move this forward. I believe every single person on this conversation wants to be in a place of identity responsiveness when and if it's appropriate for the work you're doing. The audit has become the most powerful tool in my cabinet. So let me tell you a little bit about what an equity audit meant for us. And I can take no ownership of this. This came through a really progressive funder who said at the Oak Foundation, we, for every organization we fund, do an equity audit of content, structure, organizational systems, and then human capacity within a team. We had them do an external audit of us on those dimensions. We came back with areas for improvement, but really high marks in other areas. I was able to then take that to other funders, but then also stakeholders and say, here is what this proved. Here's the money that was able to flow from that. Never underestimate the importance of interest convergence in moving the needle forward and a shared sense of we all benefit. But most importantly, the equity audit has kept us honest. So every 2 years, we bring in external folks to do an equity audit of our full curriculum, our training program, to sit with community stakeholders and say, where is there deviation from the community goals, or where is there drift because of the institutional agents involved? That helps us to really stay in a place of identity responsiveness where we're ready for that in programs, or to triage where we have slipped into benign neglect or negligence. So I really encourage you to think of what does an equity audit look like? And it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be as simple as bringing in a coalition of folks who can help you strategically have the insight into where intervention matters.
I'm noticing in the chat, folks are really resonating with so much that you've said today, John. As we all know, this could be a half-day, all-day institute to have this conversation. John, we may have to have you back for a part 2 for this. What great conversations that are happening. We want to say, first of all, John, thank you for being a part of this. Number one, being a part of the Leadership family for so many years. And I'm excited to see the continued work that'll be coming from this. I think folks know that this is being recorded, so you will get a copy of the recording after we have them all this week. And so everybody, big shout out to John for all of his continued great work at really getting us to look at, so what does it mean to reframe some of the ways of thinking around leadership development that we've, we've not done. And so thank you once again, John, so much. We, wouldn't be leadership if we didn't give a quick commercial. We've got some virtual and in-person programs that if you go to leadership.org, you will see them all there. We'd love to come to your campus or host something virtually. We're fielding a lot of requests for Catalyst these days, a one-day program. We'd love to come. We're actually talking about ways in which we as an organization can audit our programs. And we do that. And we're thinking of ways we can continue to do that with the things that we offer. And then finally, we are not-for-profit. And so please, if you're able, we'd love for you to donate to our community in some sort of way. Tomorrow, and Abby, help me out. Tomorrow, we have another virtual conversation series, and it will be
We do. I shared the link in the chat. So Dr. Tanya Williams, who's on staff at Leadership, but also does a bajillion other wonderful things, will be joining us to facilitate the topic of daring leadership, a primer to the Dare to Lead journey through Dr. Brene Brown's wonderful work. So the registration link is there. Denny Roberts, who is with us today. We're so glad to see you today, Denny. But Denny will be talking on Thursday with us about let me find your title here, Denny. I don't want to miss the title, but I'm talking about international leadership and bringing in, infusing that international perspective. So the registration link is there for Thursday. And then on Friday, a former program coordinator and cluster facilitator, Elizabeth Thompson, will be talking with us about remote work and helping people thrive. And what we've all learned through this remote time and how it's really been better for so many people to have this option of remote work. So you'll see all the registration links there, and we hope you can join us.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much.